Welcome everyone to the Cup of Coffee podcast with me, your host Tom Dillon. This is being recorded live. It's our weekly online meeting and broadcast around the world. You think I'd know that bit by now? Today's topic is how radical restructuring of UK real estate is creating a wave of triple bottom line opportunity in social housing. But with Dillon Dhanecha. Dillon did not get our memo about snappier titles being required. Before we start, I'd like to say by way of a disclaimer that today is a wonderful discussion, but that nothing said here constitutes financial advice. You should always take professional advice before investing your hard-earned cash. There may be the odd unplanned swear word along the way as well. The format for today is that Dillon will speak to us for a while, and then we'll take some questions from the floor. Dillon's the kind of human that doesn't fit categories. Born into a family of refugees and having experienced firsthand the power of stable social housing, he began housing homeless people in 2011 and refugee families from Syria in 2016. He kicked them all out in 2017. No, he didn't. No, he's not looked back since and has a moonshot mission to house 10,000 vulnerable humans by 2027 with your help. Equal parts multi-millionaire social housing investor and an international spiritual teacher. He's built a property portfolio to house vulnerable people, launched Europe's only Gold Bullion Buying Club to make the shiny stuff available to everyday people, and created the M.O.N.E.Y M.O.N.E.Y Code, a neuro-yogic energy healing modality that releases scarcity-trauma from the body and brain. That sounds like especially towards the end there, like wow. Like, geez, Louise. Good morning, Dillon. What have you got for us?
Good morning, Tom. Thank you so much for having me back. It must be like 5 or 6 years since we've spoken in this forum. It's got to be, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Pre 2020 for sure. So thank you so much for having me back. A lot has changed and nothing's changed since we last spoke. We're still doing exactly what we've always done in terms of housing vulnerable people and exploring this rather more woo and mystical side of our life experience, but it just seems to all be happening at a higher order of magnitude in some extent and a much lower order of magnitude in others. So yeah, I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you so much indeed. And I'm excited to speak to a group of property investors about what I see as the big trends in property investment and where the opportunities are and where the downside is, but also the historical context is something that I've really been keen on sharing over these last few years, because if you don't understand the historical, economic, social context of property investing and land and real estate ownership specifically, all of these latest regulation, policy, tax changes that have been coming over the last few years can take you as a surprise. Whereas if you understand the historical context of the game that we're playing, none of it takes you as a surprise, and you follow the big money and you follow the big trends and you find the big opportunity. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here with you all. Thank you so much. Shall I carry on?
Carry on, yeah.
I thought you were going to go in with a question. All right.
Miss me chance.
So I guess the opening part to all of this is you and I, all of us in this room, unless anyone was born with a silver spoon, and I'm just looking through the names and the faces on the video, and I didn't think and none of us have a lord or a lady title. And if we do, it's probably bought online. None of us look on video like we're the kind of humans that come from the land and real estate ownership class. And what I mean by that is if you go back historically, so pre buy-to-let, pre lending, pre anything that you and I are familiar with, we were never supposed to own land and real estate. The land and real estate was owned by the lords, and it was tended to by the serfs, and we are the peasants, we are the serfs, and we would rent the plots of land and probably live self-sustaining lifestyles, give all of our extra crop to the lord would sell it, make the profit, and there was this kind of symbiotic relationship between the peasants and the lords, until of course there wasn't. And then some mad bastard in France started basically burning shit down. Essentially the spark of the revolution that happened across Russia, that happened across Europe, didn't quite happen in the UK in the way that it happened across Europe and Russia. So it wasn't quite as barbaric, it wasn't quite as violent, but that was the beginning of the aspiring middle class, the rising middle class. So you had some peasants at the bottom who could see the division, who were riled up by the division, who started essentially to work their way up that social hierarchy, whether it was by pillaging, looting, and killing, or as with us in our time, through creative problem solving and through innovation and through deploying investment capital. But it's essentially the same thing. Does that make sense? Like, we're the peasants, we're the aspiring peasants, and now we've become this middle class. However, the people in control are still the lords in one way, shape, or form. And we'll just kind of hold that for a second. I'll come back to that point about who the new lords are and how essentially that division, that polarity between those who have and those that do not have land and real estate is coming back. The polarity is increasing, and we're heading towards, again, what is a rentier economy. Essentially lords, landlords and peasants. Now, once you understand that, actually Section 24 and the removal of Section 21 non-fault evictions and Article 4 selective licensing, punitive council tax laws, all of these kind of what we might consider punitive and costly measures on the middle class property investor make complete sense, correct? And they shouldn't come to us as a shock, because we should be expecting that as soon as we innovate in a way to find a new strategy, something is going to come snapping at our backsides, usually regulation, usually policy, usually taxation, that is created by the lords, or in today's world, the real lords who pull the strings, who get the politicians to create the regulation, the tax policy. Something's going to come down the line to try and shut that down. So whether it's second homes in Wales that were doing really well on the serviced accommodation market, all of a sudden they're not doing so well because the second home policy in Wales around council tax is really punitive. Selective licensing, HMO licensing that was working really, or pre-HMO and selective licensing, Article 4, that was working really well for student landlords, stopped working when those licensing schemes came into play. And at the same time those licensing schemes came into play, we started seeing huge developments of student accommodation. You only have to drive through any big city to see that HMO landlord market has all but disappeared and has been kind of gobbled up, consolidated by the bigger developers. So it should come as no surprise to us that as soon as we find a strategy through our entrepreneurial and creative endeavor that is going to squeeze a little bit more return out of this thing called real estate, something comes down the line to close that down, or to make that less attractive, or to make that harder, or to destroy the returns to a point where you start considering whether indeed the deployment of our capital in that endeavor is better than the deployment of our capital elsewhere. And you start thinking, is property investment really the thing that's going to create for me the generational wealth? Now, this environment that we're experiencing, by the way, it'd be interesting to hear of other people's kind of experiences in the chat box. Is property investing getting harder for you, or is it getting easier for you? By and large, when I'm speaking in live rooms and I can see people's hands up and nods and shakes, by and large, people are finding it harder to create the same kind of returns. But it shouldn't come as a surprise, because the environment that you and I are experiencing, the environment that you and I have developed our portfolios in, has only been in existence since 1988. Since Margaret Thatcher got her, free market glitter stick and shook it all over the sector, and all of a sudden the sector became shiny and glittery, and it drew us all in, and lending products came out, and the buy-to-let market was born in 1988, when essentially the free market philosophy of the daughter of a greengrocer started to be applied to real estate investing. So think about where the free market thinking came from. It came from an individual who essentially was a peasant with aspirations. And if you think about that dynamic, that sociological dynamic you start understanding actually why Margaret Thatcher was so passionate about right to buy and why she was so passionate about free market thinking in real estate, giving access to property and land ownership to the rising middle classes. And you start seeing why that seemed like a good idea. But the reality is, so now you put your economics hat on, the reality is that actually free market thinking can't be applied to a market that actually doesn't operate under free market mechanics. And what I mean by that is, if you're a consumer of, I don't know, watches is probably a bad, okay, if you're a consumer of, if you're, because they're slightly pricier. If you're a consumer of sticky notes, and you realize that actually these sticky notes aren't quite as sticky as a different set of sticky notes, or they're the wrong shape, or they've got mold, or the roof's leaking, or the windows are drafty, or it's the wrong location. You get my point. So if you can switch from that product to that product immediately, that's a free market. And the product developers of this thing are going to look at the loss in sales, the loss in market share, and they're going to have a look at where those sales and that share is going, and they're going to have a look at this product and say, do we need to create something that's more like this? Do we need to create something that's better? Do we need to create something that's bigger, that's more value for money, that doesn't leak, doesn't have mold, isn't drafty, is in the right locations, and is priced correctly for the consumers that we want in our business? But real estate isn't like that. You know, if you've got mold in your house as a tenant, you can't just up and leave. You can't just say, right, okay, I'm going to move next month, or I'm going to move next week. But a lot of people are stuck because their deposits are held, and even things like deposit protection schemes, they don't really work that well in terms of keeping the market liquid. Tenants might get their deposits back, but actually they get them back when it's too late, when they've already had to find another month and a half for the next place. So deposits aren't, for example, mobile, transferable. There are talks about making deposits transferable. So that free market thinking that was applied to the sector in 1988 hasn't really worked. And it's created a sector that is heavily weighed towards the benefits of the investors and the landlords, not to the customers, not to the tenants, essentially. And you've only got to read a book. I don't know whether anybody's read this book or not. I give it away at all of our one-day fast start programs. It's a book by Vicky Spratt. It's called Tenants, and it's, of course, a little bit anti-landlord, as you would expect a book like this to be, with a subtitle, The People on the Front Line of Britain's Housing Emergency. This book will open every investor and every landlord's eyes to the real plight of our customers. And most of us might be in boutique HMOs, we might be in service accommodation, we might be in different sectors of the market, but where the demand is here. So where there is massively increasing demand is for the 4.2 million people on waiting lists, for 152,000 children homeless, for 1.2 million households that are currently in accommodation that's not fit for purpose, that's maybe too small, that's in the wrong location, that maybe isn't even really habitable according to health and safety standards, or they're in temporary accommodation. Mum and dad, 3 kids living in a single HMO room. Mum, 4 children living in a travel lodge and not just for a couple of weeks. Some of these families have been in this temporary accommodation for 2, 3, or 4 years. So again, think about this economically. If we want to find the problem to solve that has the biggest demand, i.e. the biggest problem to solve, it's not actually boutique HMOs, it's not actually luxury serviced accommodation rentals, which all of it sounds quite sexy and all of it sounds quite alluring, and we all want to get our nice sexy shots of our nice sexy properties up on Instagram. But that's not really where the demand is, which is why bookings.com report a 20% drop in serviced accommodation bookings in the UK. That staycation wave is now, petering out as people start exploring international trips again. And so the HMO market we've already talked about. Let's go back to the fundamentals just for a second. Property back in 1988 was not really created as an income play. And so this is one of the challenges of property investing today, is that, since really Robert Kiyosaki and his cash flow 101 game, or that kind of era of author, that era of public speaker, that era of educator, if you like, alternative educator, properties become an income play. So they started talking about financial freedom. They started talking about financial freedom through property investment. And therefore, all of our attention went away from what property really was. It's a wealth play. It's not an income play. It's a wealth play. And we started trying to squeeze more and more income out of this real estate, which is where the hacks come, which is where the hack from taking a family home, splitting it into rooms comes from, then taking those rooms and adding an ensuite, and then taking those rooms, adding an ensuite, and then adding some nice, beautiful furniture to now make it an exclusive service accommodation. So it goes from, shitbox family home to shitbox HMO to boutique HMO to boutique serviced accommodation, apart hotel. And of course, it's not the same property, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. We've always tried to stay one step ahead of the market that is fundamentally working against us. And the reason it's working against us is that property was never designed as a cash flow play. Back in 1988, it was, save up, put a deposit down, make a tiny amount of positive cash flow. Maybe that's just going to cover your bills. Maybe that's going to make you a small amount of money. But this is about paying off your mortgage over 25 years. And then now you've got an asset for your pension that could then be sold off or then create some income. But in the immediate moment, it was not about get a property using investor capital, refurb it, refinance it, pull out all the money, fuck off to Benidorm and drink pina colitas. It was never about that. But we've turned it into that. And so because we've turned it into that, and why wouldn't we? We are creative entrepreneurs, we are innovative, and we bring investment capital to the table. And when you put investment and innovation together, all of a sudden you come up with some pretty sexy ideas. And that's what we've done. So with all of that said, again, thinking about supply and demand, we have to go now where the demand is. And we've also got this beautiful kind of almost windfall opportunity that there's huge demand. So repossessions for property investors that are the highest that they've been for a long, long time. More and more landlords are essentially handing their keys back in. So there is a supply side boom, but there's also a demand side boom. And when you put those things together, all of a sudden you start getting the triple bottom line opportunity, which I'll talk about in a second. So I'm just going to pause there for a second because I'm a little bit tired of hearing my own voice. And I'm going to hand over to you, or hand back to you rather, Tom, just to maybe comment or open up for questions, and then we can go on to the actual opportunity. By the way, was that context useful? Is my first question to you.
I think so. I find it very interesting. But they say that there's whoever you are, there's going to be 20% of people who like you, whatever you do, 20% of people who hate you, whatever you do, and then 60% in the middle who need persuading. And unfortunately, with me, I'm persuaded. Like I've been by what you've got to say more or less since the first time I saw you speaking at a tedious meeting in St Pancras, which you lit up by. As I walked into the room, I was late, and you said from the stage, "Hey, you're gonna have between now and the time you retire, you're all gonna have your worst day." And I thought, yeah, he's right. No, everyone's going to have the worst day. Some people's worst day is clearly going to be a lot worse than other people's worst days, but everyone's going to have their worst day. And he said, on that day, how are you going to be getting on? Because there's going to be some of you who are going to be under, just gone, just forget about it. Some of you are going to be hanging on by your fingernails, and some of you are going to be absolutely fine. And you're coming back to the table with cash and saying, let's do some business. Who's ready to trade? Which one are you? And then obviously by sort of extension, which one would you like to be, and what plans should you put in place to make some decisions about which one of those three groups you're going to be in? And I thought, yeah, that sounds sensible. Because everyone else was talking about financial freedom. You started talking about economic endurance, which seemed like, albeit a classic salesman rebrand, also I thought quite useful and quite interesting. And I've been working on that ever since.
And how it worked, if you think about, so that was PPN Mayfair, if you remember, or no, PPN St Pancras. And if you think about what we were talking about that back then, it was asset allocation. And it was about saying, you've got land and real estate, but between land and real estate and your risk assets, you should have a hedge, gold, and let's allocate sensibly. Let's really allocate sensibly, 60, 25, 15% as a free cash flow allocation, as a net worth allocation. And if you look at those individuals, those property investors who adopted that model back in 2013, back in 2014, back in 2015, their gold reserves have more than doubled in value. So those grams of gold that we sell as part of the Bullion Buying Club in those days were 32 to 33 pounds per gram. And those exact same grams of gold today are 66 to 72 pounds a gram. And so if you had a 25% hedge in bullion, and you experience the boom in property prices that we saw through lockdown, which was artificial and completely manipulated by the market, actually you were happy days and there was nothing ever to worry about. So yeah, that idea of economic endurance is most certainly a marketing rebrand, but it sings to a different kind of protection, and a protection of your nest egg, a protection of the thing that you're really looking to build.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely right, Anth. Absolutely right. That's exactly what's happening to the private rental sector, isn't it? It's not free at all. It's manipulated.
Yeah. I had another. I had a quick interjection, which was just for because people are lazy. What was that book you waved about? Just for anyone on the podcast or not listening.
It's Tenants by Vicky Spratt. Tenants
Okay.
by Vicky Spratt. And then there's another one which is of the same ilk by Nick Baino, which is against landlords.
Okay.
Very much more obviously against landlords, as
Yeah.
the title suggests. But
I, I'm really, I'm really surprised no one's bought me that for Christmas already. Like that's the
Maybe
perfect Christmas.
the tenants will be posting it through your door. But one of the things I do, I work a lot with shelter, and we've been working with shelter nationally
Mm.
and locally since 2011, since we started housing homeless young people. And where the Purposeful Property Project came from, this moonshot mission to house 10,000 vulnerable people, and we're really focused now not on refugees, not on homeless individuals, but on the 16 to 18-year-old space, because we go where the social demand is. Back in 2011, it was homeless people. 2016, the refugee resettlement program started coming, into play, and my family were refugees. It's always something we wanted to do. That market is still there, but it's not quite as buoyant. It's not quite, the demand isn't quite as high. Where the demand is in our local area at the moment is in 16 to 18-year-old studios. And essentially, that work that we did with shelter back in the day has resulted in me reading their reports, either publication or pre-publication reports. Anyway, so I'm reading the report in summer 2023 that's going to be published in December 2023. So homelessness numbers come out in March, usually around about summertime. Draft reports come out, and then those reports are published in December. So you might have seen the December shelter advert is usually how many people homeless this Christmas. That tends to be their theme over Christmas, which I think is a laudable theme, and certainly a theme that hits home to many of us. But this particular report wasn't just about homeless people, it was about homeless children. And this is August 2023, and I've just come home essentially with our brand new baby boy. Of course, he would be brand new because he's a baby and he's a newborn. Sounds like we just brought something back from a mail order catalogue, but essentially, we've just come home with our son. So I've got Bodhi in one arm, and I've got this draft report in the other. And we're sitting in, abject first world luxury. This is the modern part of a grade 2 listed back to stone restoration that we did. And it's, we feel very blessed to be here, very lucky to be on this kind of little mini downturn. And I've got Bodhi and I'm reading this report. And I don't know, those of you that have got children, maybe you remember the absolute shift in perspective and filter on the world as soon as you had a child. It was like, just shit just changed. The way that you looked at the world just changed. The way that you looked at opportunity just changed. The way that you looked at risk just changed. The way that you looked at your partner just changed. Everything changed. And I would never expected this fundamental shift in my filter on the world. So this stat, 138,000 children are homeless now in 2023 in the UK. It hit me like nothing has hit me before, and like it was really fucking weird, because the what I felt was the same as what I felt when I saw the refugee crisis unfolding from 2013, really, the Syrian refugee crisis has been going on a long time since then, but actually really started unfolding in a big way in 2013. And yes, I felt pain and plight for the people I was seeing on the screen, but there was this pain that I'm probably quite an empath, but I just felt a pain like closer to home. I started thinking about my parents and their plight, and my parents came here in 1972. They spent the first few weeks of their time in the country at RAF Westmoreland on a refugee camp. And so I started, like, the pain just felt a lot closer. I can't really describe it, but maybe some of you have had this experience where the pain feels really close to home. Somebody else's pain hits you in the heart. And so I just had this like overwhelming sense of the pain of 138,000 children in my head on the streets. They're not on the streets. They're in temporary accommodation, unsuitable accommodation. Basically, they're in a place that they can't call home, which is as bad psychologically and physically, and for future health chances and prospects and life expectancy and everything, as being on the streets. And over the next probably month or so, I just kind of kept talking this through with my wife and kept talking about, what can we do that's really meaningful now? Now that we don't actually have to do anything. And the 2 years pre-Bodhi, we did this restoration. We didn't really have to work. We had the blessing of really focusing our attention on building this amazing property and building a family. And it was a beautiful experience. But now it's like, okay, we've had this baby. The house is done. What do we do next? And we decided to really ramp up our work in social housing. And that's where the Purposeful Property Project was born, and which is why I'm so pleased to come and talk about this stuff, because it is really important to get as many landlords and investors as possible into social housing, not just because it's meaningful and it's high income and it's high impact, but also because it is an antidote to the manipulation that's happening in the private rental sector. The social housing sector is the place where you are not necessarily exempt from those policies and punitive tax measures, but you are able to work with them. You are able to pass on the responsibility for them. And if you're smart about tiered ownership and trustee appointment and leveraging tax advantage, actually you can do it in a way that is going to create that future generational wealth. So you get the predictable income at the front end, and you get the future generation wealth that is what we're all in property for. So yeah, there's just some of the context about where this came from. Is books like Tenants, is reports from Shelter. There's this desire to say, everyone should have a roof over their head that they can call home. Isu, yeah, can I jump in and answer that question? Is that okay, Tom? So, but how do you get in as the organizations involved in social housing do put up barriers? So number one, yes, they were from Uganda. And so we've not experienced organizations putting up barriers. Who do we work with? We work with local authorities, we work with housing associations, and we work with supported living providers. So from my perspective, social housing is all those three areas. I know that a lot of people will split those out. Supported living is one thing, assisted living is another. But actually, I combine them all into one. In fact, I just wrote an article for your Property Network magazine, the third in a series. So they've asked me to write a monthly series on social housing. And, I talk about in part one about why social housing is all those three things, because essentially it's putting a roof over the head of somebody who otherwise would not have that roof. So it could be hospital step downs. And the reason that people are blocking beds in hospitals is because they don't have the right properties to go to, which is what we can provide. The reason that refugees are in camps is because their applications are being held up, but also because there's nowhere to actually put them. So we can provide that accommodation. The reason that 16 to 18-year-old care leavers are going into respite care or going into essentially modern day orphanages is because there is not sufficient accommodation to move those 16 to 18-year-olds into. The reason that a lot of 18-year-old leavers of care, so completely free of the care system, are ending up in crime and homeless is because there is not the property for them to go to. So essentially, it's the same thing. And so we don't see that there are organizations putting up barriers. We do see that there are organizations who need educating in how private sector investors can bring both innovation and investment to the space. And we've been doing that for a long time. So now councils are absolutely wanting to partner with private sector landlords, which is why they introduced things like the private sector leasing scheme, which will lease your property for 5 years. Housing associations are a little bit odd. They're a little bit of a funny set of organizations that they're doing the same work. They are proxies for the local authorities, yet they feel they're in competition with each other. So rather than putting up obstacles to us, they actually compete with each other. But for private sector investors, they launch things like the HALS, the Housing Association Leasing Scheme, which is the same as the council scheme for 5 years. So we see it the other way. Now, there are other organizations in this space, and I'm not going to name any of them, because a couple of them are under FCA investigation at the moment, criminal investigation for fraud, and they're the companies who are asking for money to put into their social housing projects. So there's a couple of ways to do social housing. You either take your cash, give it to a company, and let them invest it into social housing, and they'll give you a return, or you do it yourself. I don't advocate for the former. I feel that you might as well do it yourself. You might as well be in control of deploying your capital. And also, some of the returns that were on offer through these companies a few years ago just didn't really seem viable to me. So we didn't ever go down that route. So they do essentially want to soak up more of the capital. But like I say, many of those are under FCA investigation and criminal investigation for fraud. So, it was essentially a Ponzi from the beginning, is my point there. The council leasing schemes are interesting, but the rates are well below market, so don't correlate making viable returns on property prices. So it's a really good question. It's a really good point, but actually not one founded in the real data. So one of the things we do we've got a 6-step model. And I can share more of that with you should you want. But the first step is defining your sector strategy. And one element of defining sector strategy is economic viability. So if you look at how, Tom, it's all right to get into some of the detail. Like, can I get into some of the numbers and the way that the rents and stuff's calculated? Because I think that's going to be really important to answer this question. Saturday morning numbers feels like a bit of a maths tuition, but this is really important. So thank you for allowing me to dive into some of the detail. So, for example, let's take the fundamental payment mechanism for social housing, whatever it is, whether it's supported living or the private sector leasing schemes, the council schemes, as you mentioned. The payment mechanism is LHA, Local Housing Allowance, LHA. So LHA rates have just been put up last year, March 2024, April 2024, and they've been frozen for a year, but they're fairly high at the moment, or high relative to what they were. But wherever they are, high, low, frozen, doesn't really matter, because the way that LHA rates are calculated, and this is what we have to understand as private sector investors, the way that LHA rates are calculated is that they offer access to the 30th percentile of the rental market. So what does that actually mean? That means that if I've got an LHA rate for 4 beds in Peterborough, that number is going to give me access to the 30th percentile of rental properties. So essentially, the lowest cost 30% of properties. Does it make sense? So the 30th percentile, that's what it's going to give me access to. Now, I don't think LHA rates will go down. They've been frozen, but I don't think they'll go down, and I'll talk about why in a second. So once you've got access to the 30th percentile of the market, that means you know where you're looking to rent. Now, here's the reality about how that data is gathered and how those rates are calculated. So they take local rental data, and rental data is naturally linked to capital values. So rental data is linked to capital values. Quite often it's not a direct link, but there are indirect links. And so, for example, the LHA rate in Peterborough is 54% lower for a 4-bed than the LHA rate in Reading. So in Reading, the LHA rate for a 4-bed is 50, I think it's 54 or 57% higher. 57 sounds more correct, but it's 57% higher in Reading than it is in Peterborough. Now, capital values in Reading for 4 beds are about 60% higher than they are in Peterborough. So approximately the same, bar a small variance. So what the councils do and what we need to do, we need to figure out what is the maximum discount on market rate that we can accept in order to hit our return on cash target. So I don't work on yield, I work return on cash. If I've got 50 grand, 60 grand, £100,000 wrapped up in a property, what is the return I'm getting on that cash? I'm not interested in yield because the yield's not realized, or the capital value of the property is not realized. This is the paper value. What's the actual return on cash? Because that's the cash I could do something else with. So we have to take what our desired return on cash is. Is it 6%, 8%, 10%, 13%, 18%, 20%? Is it infinite? What is it that we want? And then we have to decide and have a look at the numbers and say, okay, what's the discount we can give on market rents to actually attain that? And that's going to give us a variance between the local housing allowance and the rate that we need. And that's called the top up. So in Peterborough, for example, and the council, by the way, are well aware of all of this and know what their numbers are generally, which is why they launch schemes like in Peterborough, LHA plus 10% is the base level that we get. Now, that is negotiable on a property by property basis, but in the main, it's LHA plus 10%. So now, okay, now we know what we need. We know what the council's offering, or at least we can negotiate with the council or the housing association or the supported living provider. By the way, our supported living providers all pay above market rents. So that's a slightly different conversation to have, but we can negotiate with the provider. This is the rent we need, and these are the terms of the lease that we need. So how this works really well is because when these organizations take the property on, they're taking them on the equivalent of an FRI lease. So in the commercial sector, many of you will know, an FRI lease is a fully repairing and insuring lease. And so that means that you don't have any maintenance responsibilities, which then means when you're doing your calculation, so let me take a real life calculation. So we have 3 beds out to Peterborough Council and 4 beds. 4 beds we get 11554, for, 3 beds we get 8884. Both of those numbers represent LHA plus 10%. So LHA for a 3 bed is 803, we get 888. LHA for a 3 bed is about £1,000, we get 1155. So when I do my numbers, I'm looking at that number as my gross rental. I'm then looking at my second cost, which is insurance. And then I've got no other costs. I've got no maintenance costs. I've got no void costs, and I've got no management fees. So if you take maintenance off at 10%, you take voids off at 10%, you take management costs off at 10%, because they're the numbers that are they're a little bit finger in the air, but that's the standard, that's the standard calculation that we use across the sector. So if you're using that for your private sector rentals, use it for your social numbers, all of a sudden you start to see that the numbers are very favorable. And in fact, we come out at about 10.1% return on cash in both instances. In social, it's about 10.3, and in private rental sector, it's about 10.1. And again, at our one-day fast start, I break some of these numbers down, show you the examples, and you get exercised, you get tasked to do this in your area. So I would very much suggest that you start doing this in your area. One of the reasons social housing doesn't work for private sector landlords is because they're trying to shoehorn an existing property portfolio into social housing leases. So they've already got some properties. Hey, Dillon, I've got HMOs. How do I lease them out to a provider? Hey, Dillon, I've got this property. How can I find a council that will lease it from me? Hey, Dillon, I've got this, but the council scheme won't work for me. The numbers don't work. Well, of course they don't work, because we did not acquire the property specific and strategically to the exit. So you wouldn't buy a boutique HMO in a shit part of town. And you wouldn't buy a social housing property in the same area as you would create a boutique HMO. And I know that that's a very obvious and simple answer or simple description, but in essence, there's this grey area in the middle where properties seem like they could be good for social, but because they weren't acquired specifically to the numbers that we need, all of a sudden the whole thing is skewed. So really, for investors, it's better to start from scratch. I do loads of portfolio reviews, and by and large, the outcome is that we have to get rid of 80% of the portfolio, release the capital, and then buy specifically to the strategy. And so essentially, LHA works in all areas of the country, because in all areas of the country, it gives access to the 30th percentile of the market, where it becomes unaffordable for people to rent. is because quite often there are not enough houses to rent in those social housing areas. So people have to go out of area. So they're getting a local housing allowance, which should be giving them access to a property in the 30th percentile, but they're having to top up by 100 or 200 or 300 pounds, not because the landlord needs to make more money, but essentially because they're in the wrong area. So housing is not, I did a post on LinkedIn the other day, housing is not a supply issue. You know, building 1.5 million houses isn't going to solve the crisis. Housing is a distribution and a utilization issue when you look at economics. The same as food. You know, it's not like there's not enough food to go around the world. We don't need no more farms. We just need better utilization and better distribution. And so one of the things that we're doing as a property owner, as a portfolio holder, as a portfolio builder, is seeking to exit the entire space within the next kind of 6 to 10 years, depending on when the right timing is economically. And what we do is we offer options. I'm an options trader by background. We offer options to councils, to the providers, to buy the properties from us. And we're also shaping up the entire portfolio to exit en masse. And again, I can talk a little bit more about that in a more practical session with you. So our intention is not just to house the 10,000 vulnerable people, but is actually to replenish social housing stock by putting all of our properties into that sector permanently by selling them to operators in that area in the next 6 to 8, 10 years. And I guess that leads to the end goal of what we're doing. We're building, scaling, and exiting the portfolio. And we're exiting the portfolio in a way that is not by accident. So we're not getting to a point where we've been in the landlording game for 10 years and now we've decided we've had enough, or 20 years, and we've got this portfolio and some of it does that and some of it does that and some of it looks like this and some of it looks like that. What we're doing is building a portfolio strategically in order to exit. So whilst there might be a variation of actual real estate, 2 beds, 3 beds, 4 beds, studios, etc., they all do the same thing essentially. They all house or are leased to a similar tenant type, i.e. a local authority, a social housing housing association, or a supported living provider. And we don't do anything that's really extreme need. So when you look at the buildings, when you look at a studio development designed for 16 to 18-year-olds, it looks like a studio development designed for the private rental sector. It's just there's some bits and pieces in there for these younger kids. But essentially the tenant type is the same. The income, and this is where the bottom line comes in, the income is fixed, linked to the lease agreement. The costs are fixed, linked to the lease agreement. So the returns are predictable. The cash flow is predictable. The return on cash is predictable. So all of a sudden you're selling a widget-based business. It's like you've created a business for post-it notes. And whilst the post-it notes might, have different colors and have slightly different shapes, they all do the same thing. So you package this whole thing up and say, hey, this is for sale. You don't say, I've got a property and essentially, they're all yellow because they're all made of bricks and mortar, but one does sticky notes and one does reference cards. And then what happens when you sell a property portfolio like that is you send the spreadsheet to the agent. The agent contacts his or her investors and say, hey, Tom's selling his portfolio. Here's a list of the 50 properties he's got. The agent never asks, how much will you pay for the portfolio or how much will you pay for the business? What does the agent ask? Which ones do you want? And so the person buying the portfolio starts cherry picking. And that process is iterative. And the agent comes back to you, Tom, and says, hey, Tom, out of the 50, I've sold 40, but you're going to be left with these 10 shit ones because no one wants them. And that's because we didn't build the portfolio strategically in order to exit it at the back end. And so many landlords are in that problem right now where they've got portfolios, they don't know how to exit, they can't exit, they're exiting, they're losing the best ones, so they're left with the shit. So now they've got an even less profitable portfolio, and the whole thing is a bit of a mess. So build, scale, and exit is kind of the roadmap to how you can get into social housing, where the demand is, use this supply side boom in real estate that we're getting. And I don't care what the Halifax house price report says, what the Mortgage Works monthly survey says. When you talk to agents on the ground, they've got more listings than they've had in many, many years. They've got less viewings than they've had in many, many years, and they are overstocked. And the only reason prices are seemingly higher is because agents aren't catching up to the need to meet supply and demand with a reduction in price. And so we're already in some areas of the country, 10, 15% down. So it's almost like an invisible correction. I think we've probably got about another 5, 8% to go before we start seeing the uplift potentially. Yeah, it'd be good to pick things up in another meeting, but yeah, I'd absolutely love to do that. So we do a 1-day fast start, which is it's all content. It's basically 8 hours of pure content. Well, I've got 6 steps: SOCIL, sector strategy, optimizing results, collaboration pipelines, which is you and your market. These 3, you and the market. And then IAL, income acceleration, asset allocation, which is what we talked about at PBN St Pancras. And then legacy leaving. How do you use tiered ownership, tax advantage, and trustee appointment to leave that legacy? And I spend an hour on each one. Each one is 3 processes. So there's 18 individual processes, or investor plays as we call them, that will help you to define your sector strategy, that will help you to code for performance and growth, that will help you to build and write collaboration pipelines with essentially vendors, investors, and providers. And then there's 3 income acceleration strategies. One of them is selling packaging options in the way that I explained earlier. And then you've got asset allocation between wealth assets, hedging assets, and risk assets. And then legacy leaving, which is all around, like I said, tiered ownership, trustee appointment, and tax advantage. So yeah, I'd love to come and join us. 9th of February is the next one if you're in the country. 2nd of March is the one after that if you're in the country for that. I'd love you to come and join us. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dillon. Just a few quick questions and then we'll wrap it up. So, sticking on the program that you're doing, so that because I'll forget to ask about this in a minute, but it sounds great. How can people find out more if they're interested? We can put a
So
link with
yeah, so the best thing to do. So there is a link. If you go to, shall I put it in the chat box?
Yeah, stick it in the chat box and I'll publish it with the podcast for those listening to the podcast.
Thank you. Very, very grateful, man. I'd love to see as many of you there as possible for us to really unpack this stuff. So Social Housing Pro, and then if you use the code FSNY for Fast Start New Year, Fast Start a New Year, that will take 50% off the price of a VIP ticket. So it's fully catered, it's all content. There's nothing to buy after that in terms of there's no pitch on the day. If you want to find out about mentoring programs, and you can do that after the event, that's up to you. You can reach out to us, that's fine. But there's nothing to buy on the day, fully catered. We really look after you. You walk away with your own playbook, 18 processes. You get 37 days free trial to our AI software. So the company gives you 7 days, and then I've bought a coupon for you for £99.99 to give you a month extra. So from the Monday, you can actually start executing on the processes. The other thing I've also put in there as a resource is a database that my team have created that is the database that we use internally, and that's got over 13,000 supported living providers, and we're giving that away as an extra bonus for the February and March dates. February is almost sold out because we're 9 days away as of today, so it's next Sunday, February. So if I were you, I'd book on for the March date, March the 2nd. There's a good chance that February is sold out already. To 13,000 providers, and that database you can sort by county. You can search for the kind of supported living provider, so what kind of support do they provide. There's contact details on there. Their CQC registration is on there, so you know that they are approved by the Care Quality Commission. And the reason for that is that we're not building an education business. We're building a tribe that will help us on our moonshot mission to house 10,000 vulnerable people. And when you do the numbers, it's actually not that many private sector investors need to make the switch, and they don't need to house that many vulnerable people for us to hit 10,000. So I think we'll get there sooner than we think we will. But yeah, social housing, socialhousing.pro, I think the URL was. Was that right? Did that work? Let me just double.
Yeah, it works a treat. So as you say, the URL for anyone who's lazy is www.socialhousing.pro, and the code for the discount is Foxtrot Sierra November Yankee, and it's all in capitals on here. Isu asks, where is this program being held? My guess is
So
it the Heartland
yeah.
of Peace?
It is, yes. So it's in the Marriott Hotel, fantastic hotel. Like I said, fully catered. It's just off the A1, so dead easy to find. 10 minutes from the train station. The train station's 45 minutes from King's Cross, so really easy to get to. Free parking on site. Yeah, all you have to do, just bring yourself. Everything
Yeah.
else is sorted for you. Yeah, and 10 till 6. So it's a 10 a.m. start, 6 p.m. finish, registration at 9:30. So it is a full packed day.
Yeah, forget the program. Get into the bar. Lovely bit of food in the Marriott. Um, where do the councils get the funds to buy all these portfolios in 10 years' time? I think Ant's worried the councils are going to be broke.
Yeah, and they are going to be broke. But if you think about it, they're already spending 24 billion pounds a year. That's up from 17.2 last year on temporary accommodation. So we work directly with. I just had a meeting with head of housing strategy and head of property last week at a local authority. So we work directly at that level. Heads of housing strategy, heads of property, heads of housing needs, and then my team works with the commissioning teams to start deploying the real estate. But when you start talking at a strategic level, they are well aware of the money that they're spending on temporary accommodation. And now they're looking for these kind of public-private partnerships in order to make that transition from temporary to permanent accommodation. And that's why, I don't advise emergency accommodation. I don't advise temporary accommodation. I'm not interested in nightly rates. We're interested in tackling the longer term demand permanent accommodation. So they're already spending the money. Their job, as they are well aware, is to transition that money and those people from temporary to permanent. And so think about this as when you go and buy a lease option, essentially, how do you find the money in 6 years' time to execute on the option? So I've built my entire portfolio on lease options since 2011. All we're doing is allowing them the same benefit. So the way that it normally works is they'll pay a slight supplement on the rent. That goes towards essentially building up the deposit. They might pay an option fee up front as well, which can either be taken off the end purchase price or is taken as a fee. So there's lots of different ways to structure options. And of course, because they're commercial, they understand lease options in a way that residential market doesn't really, because they already have options on buildings and this is the way that they already do business. So yeah, it's a fascinating space to work in, a real fascinating space to work in.
Certainly is. I'd love to ask 100 more questions, but everyone's going to shoot me if I do. So I won't. What I will do instead is thank you, everyone, for attending. For everyone listening to the podcast, watching on YouTube, we appreciate all of you, and of course, very special thanks to our wonderful speaker, Mr. Dillon Dhanecha. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
When I come around to your house, I'm looking forward to a cacao or similar beverage or whatever's going on at the time. Dillon, with his many skills, does a wonderful line in all kinds of fancy drinks. So I'll go around to his house. See you all on the next one.